right. Today, we are lucky to be able to spend some time with Dr. Hussein Rajput. Hussein has been Hamline's Director of Counseling and Health Services for, how long have you been the Director?
15 years, Kelly.
Oh, for the last 15 years. So today we are going to talk about staying healthy, reducing your risk, and coping effectively with the mental health impacts of the coronavirus. So Hussein, thank you for being a part of this.
Sure, glad to be here.
The question we like to start off with everyone is, how have you been doing these last few months with everything?
Well, I think the honest answer is, I have my good days and my bad days. I think that as compared to lockdown in March, where I was feeling honestly like I was just trying to take it one day at a time, I feel like I've adapted somewhat more to the new normal, so to speak. And I feel like I've established some good routines for self-care, but I would be lying if I didn't acknowledge that, yeah, sometimes I feel stressed out and kind of overwhelmed by all of this too. So, I think that's where I have to practice what I preach. So the things that I'm encouraging students to do, when I'm meeting with them for counseling sessions, it kind of keeps me honest, or there's some accountability built in there too, that if I'm not doing the same things that I'm recommending to them, that it starts to feel a little hypocritical.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah.
Good. Can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of concerns that you and your staff are hearing from students? What are they saying about their physical and mental health challenges?
Sure. What I think probably I should preface this by saying that there isn't like a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I think it's such a wide range of experiences that that students are having. Obviously, there are students who are profoundly impacted by the pandemic, whether directly in terms of health impacts on themselves. Some of the students at Hamline who have had COVID themselves, had people close to them who have had it, who have lost a close friend or relative as a result of the pandemic. And so, first and foremost, want to acknowledge, just the direct impact that that the virus has had on some of the folks in our community. The ripple effects of that, especially I think the financial impact, as you all are aware, a number of our students have been employed in service industry jobs, say retail or restaurant or work, where because business has really dried up, many of them have lost jobs or had hours significantly reduced and have had to scramble to find other options for paying for their education. I'm talking to a lot of students who are cobbling together part-time jobs to try to make ends meet, but are still really feeling very stretched thin. And so while I think in our office we see the mental health impacts, the outcomes show up in terms of depression, in terms of anxiety and things like that, I would say like the root causes in many cases are financial and economic. I think that's that's a huge piece for many of our students. Also just adapting to change and loss, I would say, is a big theme for a lot of our students. Thinking about students who have lost out on opportunities, whether that was to study abroad or to do an internship, or our student athletes who have had seasons canceled or postponed. There's been just a lot of disruption, certainly for people who have had to change their living situation, move back home, things like that. I mean, it's just a lot of transition, a lot of change to adapt to, and in some cases, I think students are still grieving those losses, or kind of thinking about what could have been. I think about our first year students and ways in which, for many of them, the spring of senior year of high school was highly disrupted, obviously, and now they're coming into college under less than ideal circumstances, and so they're having to to adapt and be creative. And so those are just some of the themes. I could obviously go on, but those are some of the themes that are coming up in the work that we're doing in supporting students in counseling.
Yeah. So I mean, speaking for myself, I know that I've had some stressful times these last 6 months. Can you talk a little bit about what is stress and how it manifests itself in people?
Sure. So one definition of stress, and this goes back to one of the first researchers on this, a man named Hans Selye, back in the 30s, talked about stress as kind of the non-specific response of our body in the face of a challenge or a demand. And that might seem a little bit vague, but the idea being that that our bodies and our brains react to stressful circumstances or challenges in the environment by preparing to respond in some way. So we could think about fight or flight, if people harken back to their biology classes in high school perhaps, or maybe currently too. That's, we can think about that as a stress response, and how we experience stress has a lot to do with whether we feel like we have the resources to deal with that stressor. If it feels like our resources are adequate, if we have, coping skills, if we have good support networks, if we have seen a similar situation in the past and we kind of know what to do, then our response to that stress will probably, it will probably be more of a kind of rising to the challenge. If we feel overwhelmed by that stressor, or maybe the combination of having too many stressors on our plate, and we don't feel like we have adequate resources to be able to manage that, that situation, then we're likely to experience that that stress in a negative way. And chronic stress, a chronic ongoing experience of feeling stressed out or overwhelmed has a number of negative health implications potentially. And so that's something that we want to really try to help students develop a good repertoire of coping skills to deal with.
Wow. So what is anxiety and how is it related to stress?
Sure. So I think about anxiety as in some ways similar to stress in that it can have sort of both positive and negative aspects to it. Anxiety, like any emotion, it provides us with information. And I think about anxiety as anticipating future events that may present a potential threat or risk or even danger. And so in some ways, we can think about that as being really useful or adaptive, that anxiety might help us prepare for an anticipated challenge or something that's coming up. It might help us, foresee that and be ready for it. And in that sense, anxiety can actually be pretty useful. It's when anxiety becomes chronic, ongoing, interfering with our day-to-day functioning, that it potentially can be problematic. And so that's one of the, sort of, and I guess we'll probably talk about this a little bit, but, sort of criteria that I would use of like, when is it a concern or an issue? I also did try to encourage students to differentiate between, again, when is anxiety helpful for, motivating you to take steps to prepare for a challenge, versus when it might be more like spinning your wheels or like ruminating about something that you can't directly control, and in which case it's just kind of keeping you kind of revved up with nowhere to channel that energy.
Yeah. So, I mean, God, there's more than enough things to like worry about and be anxious about these days. I mean, that the actual health of the virus itself and your health or the health of your loved ones, the financial impact and job loss, the state of politics. There's just so much going on. We were talking with Nancy, and just like I've watched way too much news, and it just sort of actually one of the things I've been trying to do is not watch quite as much, because it just sort of amps up your level of worry. But are there some ways you can manage your worries or manage that anxiety, and is that even possible, or how do you even begin to do that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think you actually touched on one of the ones that I recommend a lot. I mean, one of the challenges of living in this, interconnected, global village, so to speak, is that we are taking in information from, literally it's possible to take in information from, all different corners of the world with all the multitude of news sources that we have access to. And that can be really powerful and really useful for, being an informed citizen, but it can also be, more information than our brains even really evolved to handle. So we can literally be carrying kind of the weight of the world, on our shoulders or in our minds. And so that's where I think it is really important to, to be judicious about how much you take in. And it's okay to just kind of get the gist of things or get the headlines, enough to be informed, but then not necessarily immerse yourself too deeply in it, especially if it feels like you've got, a lot of other things going on or a lot of other, kind of stressors or concerns. Going back to kind of what I was talking about earlier in terms of like kind of the ratio of challenges to resources, I think a big part of managing both stress and anxiety is if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling stressed out, to be really intentional about how do you build up kind of your stockpile of resources to help you cope. And that might be internal resources. It might be things that you do in terms of self-care. There's the adage, you can't pour from an empty cup. So, it's very hard to, to devote time and energy to important pursuits if you don't have much to give. So thinking about how do you replenish or restore those resources. The foundations of that, I think, are, good sleep, good nutrition, exercise, social support, those sorts of things provide, kind of the base level of that. And then also, not just thinking about this as a solo project, but that community support, connections with your social network, with your friends and family, even if some of it has to be virtual, that can be really important as a stress buffer. The research suggests actually that social support is the #1 stress buffer. So those are a couple things that I think can be helpful for managing.
Good. So you touched on this a little bit, but some stress and worry is certainly a part of life, right? But what things should we look for that might signal it's time for us to reach out for help?
Yeah, great question. So I guess as a clinician, I tend to focus on kind of 3 dimensions that could be useful criteria for deciding when to seek out counseling or some form of professional help. And they are duration. So how long has something been going on? Frequency of symptoms. So if you're having recurrent, say, panic attacks or something like that, and they're happening like multiple times a day, that might be another criteria. And then severity, like if something just feels really overwhelming or unbearable, or if it's getting to the point of, say, having suicidal thoughts or things like that, those 3 variables in combination, or even one of them, like if it's been intense enough, to me are indicators that maybe it's time to to seek out support of some kind.
So, Hussein, I mean, the pandemic's been going on for 6 months, and as a novel virus, we're learning new things about how it works in the world. And we've heard sort of changing and mixed messages about how to protect yourself and others. I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us sort of like, what's the latest thinking about what are things you should be doing to stay healthy and reduce the risk of transmission?
Sure. And I think one of the things it's an understandable source of frustration that, that we have and sometimes receive mixed or contradictory messages. I think we have to remember that this is science unfolding in real time, and that sometimes, science, yields contradictory information, or that, it takes a while, to kind of get refined enough to get more definitive answers. And so, that comes with the territory. Then we also have the overlay of politics on top of it, which has made things, more complicated. I think for me, the probably the main thing that I emphasize, and I'm not a healthcare professional, so I want to shy away from giving recommendations in that regard. But I really emphasize consider the source of the information, and so I really encourage for our students you can get good up-to-date information about COVID on campus at Hamline, from the Counseling and Health Services webpage. The Minnesota Department of Health is a really good source for accurate information about what's going on, in the state of Minnesota, and kind of the current picture. I think you'll find that still the kind of the basics of social distancing, wearing a mask, limiting the amount of time that that you're in indoor spaces in close proximity, to people, that all still seems to be very much, consensus, best practices. But I think those sources are really, probably good places to go for reliable information.
Yeah, thanks.
Good. So before we let you go, we want to give you an opportunity to really talk about counseling and health services. What can students expect when they reach out to counseling and health?
Sure. Well, I think probably the big thing to emphasize is that although a lot of our services are virtual, all of our counseling services are virtual this year, and our health services are virtual in most cases for the initial consultation, and then the providers will make a determination if there's a need for an in-person appointment after that. Other than that, I would say that it's very similar to what students would have experienced, in a previous year. If they, call the office, they'll talk to Summer, our administrative assistant, who's, very warm, kind, friendly, awesome human being, and help them, get connected, with the, the right person. And so I think a lot of the process is very similar, just at a distance. And, I'll say, I was a little bit hesitant about how counseling was going to work virtually, a little bit skeptical. I still, have my own bias or preference to be able to meet with folks face to face. But I think one of the lessons for me of this whole experience has been realizing that there are upsides, and that there are students for whom transportation or access to campus is really a barrier. And so, there are some folks who I think have told me, that they actually really like doing virtual sessions for the convenience and for the accessibility part. So, we're trying to seize those silver linings where we can.
Yeah, awesome. Great. Well, Hussein, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. It's great to talk with you both.